Chair, the committee is probably aware that Mr Strong has just been appointed as CEO. In fact, I think this might be week 2, is it?
No, day 4.
Day 4.
I
I'm
don't think
sure you
Mr
want to
Strong's
welcome him.
any stranger to strong examination and ability to stand up to the process. So welcome, Mr Strong.
Thank you, Chairman.
Genuine welcome. Would this be your first estimates in any capacity, or have you been here before?
First estimates, not first Senate committee.
Good.
Yep.
All right, well, welcome. We'll go gently, not. Would you like to make any opening statement?
Only very briefly.
Of
thank
course,
you for your
the
time.
floor is yours.
Thank you for your time and for having us present to the senators this morning, and just flagging.
Could you, in doing this, just share a little breakdown of your history too that's led you to I'm not sure that everyone would know your history as much as some.
Okay. So I started with MLA as Managing Director on Monday. Most recently I've been working for a feedlotting business, Smithfield Cattle Company, which is a feedlotting and cattle supply business that runs 2 feedlots in Queensland, a family business that turns over about, it has a one-time capacity of 24,500 head. Prior to that I was the Managing Director at the Australian Agricultural Company. I was there for 5 years in a marketing role, then the Managing Director role. Prior to that I actually worked with MLA in the European market, and also earlier on the Meat Standards Australia program, and spent some years working with some commercial start-up businesses around DNA technology and genetics and genomics, which ultimately worked with Pfizer as well. So I've had interest myself in livestock production all the way through to processing experience with a varied experience in the industry. So very, very committed beef and red meat industry career. The other thing I would flag this morning, Chairman, is that Andrew Ferguson, our Chief Financial Officer, is also here. Andrew's been filling in as the Managing Director since Mr Norton left in December, and Claire Stannick's our Company Secretary and Legal Counsel as well. So hopefully we'll be able to cover anything that you need to know today between us.
So I shouldn't have interrupted your opening remarks if you need to make any.
No problem, that's it, we're good.
Oh, good?
Yep.
All right, thank you. Senator.
Sorry.
Senator Still.
Yeah, thank you. Senator McCarthy. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Mr Strong. Can I just go to your carbon neutral plans?
Yes.
By 2030. Can you update the committee as to the work that you're trying to do to achieve your target of being carbon neutral by 2030?
Thank you for the question. That's obviously one of our most public and ambitious statements that we've made in the last 2 or 3 years. I think it was made at the AGM 2 years ago, and on the back of identifying what things were going to be challenging for our industry at the time and moving forward, and how do we take a proactive position on trying to deal with those things and get in front of it. And the impact on climate, and particularly the livestock impact on carbon production, was a big issue for the industry, remains so, and as a result of that, the industry through MLA made a commitment that by 2030 the plan would be for the livestock beef industry to be carbon neutral. At this stage, largely those projects are still in their early stages. So
what are the projects? Are you able to tell us?
So there's a number of projects across some of our pillars, which around supply chain efficiency, for example, and also in productivity.
Yep.
And at this stage, largely those projects are looking at what are the impacts and what are the areas that could be most effective as far as improvements and change is concerned.
And so, do you know where they're taking place? I mean, I'm interested obviously with the North and Northern Australia and the Northern Territory. Are you able to give us any details about?
So the short answer is no. There are some examples though of individual producers already that have taken very proactive steps, and there's one in Victoria, for example, who is in a position of claiming a carbon positive production system. So even though the industry programs are still in very early stages, then there are examples in the industry of where individual producers are being proactive. But I don't have specific details location-wise where those are, but we'd be happy to put together a brief summary of those and get back to the committee with that.
Okay. It will be something that I'd like to follow along, obviously, because that is a very bold statement and an important one in terms of the target for 2030.
Certainly.
Is MLA aware of Minister Littleproud's report into agricultural innovation, a national approach to grow Australia's future?
We are.
And you are aware of the 5 recommendations?
Yes, we are. Yep.
And what steps will MLA undertake to address the recommendations?
So there's a number of things that report cuts across at the moment, and not the least being our annual investment plan and our strategic plan, but also the 2050 vision that the broader group of RDCs have been working on as well. And even though that report's reasonably recently printed, we're aware of those 5 recommendations, and even though we haven't had any direct instruction or inquiry about actions on those, we're certainly conscious of them as we are thinking about our next year's planning cycle. In some ways, I think we are deferring a little bit to the broader group of RDCs and making sure that we make the most progress we can in those areas without creating too much duplication. And Andrew's actually on the Council of RDCs, so might be able to make a more informed comment about
Sure.
where those things
Mr.
are fitting
Ferguson?
in.
Absolutely. So the Council of RDCs commenced a process of essentially looking out to 2050 to understand what across the agricultural sector innovation might look like. So that process was, preceded the EY review, and indeed was almost at its conclusion for that first phase, certainly, and would have informed and did inform the EY review. The Council of RDCs published a brochure and then a fuller document about what that vision statement was in respect of 2050 across the agricultural innovation ecosystem. There are 2 main recommendations from that. The first was that we would develop and implement a national framework to drive a globally connected, high-performing and effective knowledge and innovation ecosystem, so very similar to the second recommendation in the EY review. It's with that recommendation that the Council, in the last month or so at a meeting, I think on the 4th of March, endorsed that as a finding and as a recommendation, and the executive of the Council are in the process of understanding what that vehicle might look like to enable the RDCs as a group to come together on some of the larger cross-sectoral, larger transformational type projects, and those are typically going to include environment and water, soils, animal health, biosecurity, traceability, those types of things. And it's envisaged that where we can identify that there's clearly areas that go across perhaps not all of the RDCs, but many of the RDCs, that rather than running our own race, we will come together in a more structured and cohesive way to ensure that we're getting the best result.
Has MLA been asked by either the Minister or the Department to act on those 5 recommendations?
Not at this stage that I'm aware of, no. No.
Are you expecting that you will get instructions or advice in relation to that?
I expect we would.
Okay.
Yeah,
The
but
report also stated, Mr. Strong, and I'll just read this quote, investment portfolios are largely focused on applied commodity-specific and incremental innovations. The innovation focus needs to shift towards a more balanced approach to deliver greater transformational innovation, address cross-sectoral challenges and target economic, environmental and social outcomes. Does MLA agree with this statement?
So broadly, I think when you look at all of our programs, that yes, we do, where while it's vitally important that we are able to make incremental change and improvement, particularly to current practice, and focus on what we can apply immediately to move forward, as I think when we look at our broader programs and the broader supply chain challenge, we have to come up with certainly more innovative and solutions which provide us with different and potentially significantly different ways of doing things to create and capture more value across the supply chain. And as far as action goes, I think that's where we see one of the opportunities for us in the way that we manage particularly our commercially engaged R&D programs, where we're partnering with individual businesses or companies that have ideas about a significant activity that might fundamentally change the way we do things, that we can then partner with, and also, of course, the government partners with some of those as well. So certainly in our R&D programs, we do have a split already in things which are going to make or have immediate benefit, or potentially immediate benefit if we can get them applied, and those things which might significantly change. So investing in things like the DEXA technology, for example, to provide us with more comprehensive information than what we've had previously, to allow us to make better decisions and better manage our product through the supply chain.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Strong. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, so just before I go to Senator McGrath, the DEXA technology,
Yeah.
so that program seemed to have sort of slowed down. There was a lot of energy and expectation sort of 18 months ago about the introduction of it, particularly across the export plants, of which we heard there were 80 today. I always thought there was 92, but there may have been a contraction in the market there. Yeah. Where is it at? There was figures of 150 million through the donor company, made up of contributions from MLA stakeholders and obviously attracting some research funding, or match funding from the federal government. Where is it at, Mr Strong? Because I'm not a supporter of that. I've got some serious questions that hang over this dual XA program.
So I don't have a number on exactly the spend on it to date, but we'll find that for you. Yeah. But the investment in that specific and type of technology cuts across both sheep and beef. And in sheep, it's been going
sheep much more advanced. It's been in there for a good while.
Exactly, much more advanced and more effective demonstrated benefit. On the beef side, we have
well, on the benefit, it's to do with the carcass bust down in sheep. We've not had any evidence that genetically the data that can come from it. So I've always believed it is a precursor to automation in the processing sector. Without it, they won't be able to go to robotic automation, if you like, which is what's happened in part, at least with the quarters in the sheep industry.
Certainly. So it's one of the things that it does, of course, is instruct the use of robotics and provide a much higher definition and higher quality set of information to use. I think the other premise is being able to provide more accurate information on value and volume of products, so quality and yield, and particularly on the beef side.
Yeah, but this is where I'm keenly interested, and I'm going to take a minute, if I can, Senator McGrath, before I come to you. So I'm a producer.
Yep.
I got a cow-calf operation. I take a weaner and, 8, 10 months, 12 months, I sell it to a backgrounder who holds it for 100 odd days, perhaps, maybe longer, and then into a feedlot, similar periods of time. So post me, there's 2 other owners. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily know who the sire is, which bull. I may have a particular bloodline of bull, but I don't know who the bull is. And I probably don't know who mum is. I mean, at AA, did you match up every calf with every cow?
No.
So I don't know who mum is. So 30 months later, and there's a chance that a third of my herd may have turned over, mum might be gone. The bulls are certainly not going to play a role if I'm retaining heifers. So I get my 1,000 of the mob that I produced now 28 months ago through the hands of two other entities who, what they do will impact on the quality of the carcass, or didn't do. So I used to have this out with your predecessor. So I get this information. I've got 1,000 of them laid out on my kitchen table up at the farm. Apart from giving me some overall genetic picture that I've probably got the wrong bloodline or the wrong quality of cows, how am I ever to apply that information in a practical sense as a producer? Now, my good friend and your predecessor said, well, you get DNA testing done on the cow and all the bulls and the calves at $15 a head, $45. Well, that's, no one's going to do that. How is it applied? Because and the reason I'm interested is, if it was just Rizzo's people's money and AMEC and all of that crowd, I wouldn't have a bother. But there was talk of $50-odd million contribution from the Cattle Council levies.
So, Senator, as you've laid out that example, it's challenging to see that return on an individual animal or a unit basis. But I think that the discussions is very closely tied to the Senator's question about investment and innovation, and separately we can talk about execution and how we make some of those decisions. But we do have to be thinking about what is it that we need to actually move the needle and make a big difference, and having more information is one of those. And what you're highlighting now is having more information then has to be able to be used as well. So how do we then...
But Mr. Strong, I'm not opposed to innovation, and I know where this is beneficial, particularly if we, and I'm of a mixed view about robotics in meatworks, because I just know the impact it'll have if we reduce workforces in some of our communities at Oakey and all sorts of other places, right? But you know, that's a fight for another day. So I understand the overall push for innovation. What I don't understand is to take $50 million worth of socialised funds by cattle producers to go into a project where I see zero benefit for them. I see a benefit to the industry, the sector, down the road on the supply chain, but I'll tell you what, it's going to happen to some producers who donated generously to the introduction of it. When this additional innovative reports come from the looking at a carcass, they're going to get less money for it. Right? So their reward for investing in this technology is less money. And the plants that don't have it will be at a complete disadvantage to the plants that do have it. So I feel, I'm going to be gone in 5 minutes, so it won't matter, my voice will go silent, but I feel very, very strongly about that element of it, the producers' socialised funds, and Mr. Ferguson, but I'll direct it to you, you might take the question, with the potential budget that's sort of in the ether for the full introduction of this, is it still $50 million from the Cattle Council?
No, I think it'd be very unlikely, Senator. The initial proposal for the project, which was, I guess, referred to in terms of Project 150, which was the $150 million that we thought would be required to put a DEXA installation in every plant, or every accredited plant, I was at that stage we were exploring how that might be funded as an all-of-industry initiative. Importantly, an all-of-industry initiative because a lot of the work that was done about the return on investment across the supply chain was dependent upon that information being consistent across the supply chain. I think the world's moved on a little bit. The DEXA project is still ongoing. We no longer refer to it as Project 150. Processors, individually and independently of each other, are taking on this technology.
Will they have socialised funding support?
No, there is socialised funding. So generally speaking, certainly the model going forward is largely that the processors themselves will put in some cash. The levy from the processing side will put in some cash, and then the federal matching will also go into that model, and roughly in a 25%, 50% model. So at this stage, on an ongoing basis, research and development for the identification of how those models might work is largely without producer levies.
All right, well, one more question in that specific space. One of the processors owns the technology, correct? Or has a majority ownership of the corporation that owns the technology, the New Zealand technology. Is that correct?
So no, I don't. So I know what you're referring to, but I don't think they own the DEXA technology. I think they're involved in some of the robotics installations.
Oh, no, we've had evidence
building.
they held 51% share in the company that owned the DEXA technology from New Zealand.
So,
Okay, I'm not sure.
The DEXA technology, Senator, is not owned by that company. It is commonplace within the medical industry. It's exactly the same technology. The New Zealand company you're referring to have been involved in the implementation and the installation of that technology.
Hardware. So you're saying the technology's, it's generic, if you like.
DEXA technology is generic.
But, all right, let me go the other way then. The hardware, the installation of how it will go into a plant, one of the major processors, does it not, and I'll ask the question rather than make the statement, does one of the major processors own a majority shareholding in the corporation, I believe it is a corporation, that is involved in these installations and the supply of hardware?
So yes is the short answer to that,
Okay,
Senator.
so
the extension of that is that it would not need to only be that company.
No, I appreciate that, but to date it is that company.
Yes.
Will they receive any socialised funds towards the acquisition of hardware from their own company to install it in their plant?
Insofar as the installation costs and fees for installation are part and parcel of the cost of the project, then yes.
Does anyone else other than me have a problem in that? I'd like a bit of that. No problem? Well, let's not get into whether you think there's a problem or not. I'd like you to, Mr. Strong, as I asked your predecessor, to think on the issue. For me, it's just, there's a kosher question in it, to be honest.
So we certainly understand the question and the comments that you've made, Senator, and we'll take it on board.
So I can't ask for any more than that. My colleague who got called away now just wants me to touch on the situation in North Queensland or Northern Australia with the floods.
Yep.
Can you tell the committee any activities that the MLA may be undertaking, specifically event-specific, and whether the events or the circumstances of the events feed into any other work the MLA is doing in relation to like potential, because the disruption to including any monitoring the disruption to the markets that are occurring up there, supply into processors and the live job and the like.
So as far as being involved in the response and activity around the specific events, particularly the flooding in the Gulf, MLA provided a very significant supporting role to the lead agency, which was AgForce. We published quite a bit of information, made sure that was available in as many possible ways that we could, and made sure that those that were offering support and service on the ground had all the information that we could possibly find to help them and support them in doing that. And there's a little more that we could actually do. We don't obviously have skills or resources in the areas that are required to do the on-the-ground work, so we did everything we possibly could to support agencies like AgForce, which were obviously very present on the ground. As far as what happens now, particularly around information and what's happening out of the supply as a result of that, we don't have any quantifiable information, and the industry doesn't have any quantifiable information about the impact or potential impact of any losses that might have occurred in those events. until we actually get through, or certainly into or through some of that northern activity in at least the first round of muster, and particularly the
So what
potentially the
action's
second.
been taken there? Who's on point to collate that?
So we do that as part of our normal projection. So we've the last round of those came out in January. The next round will come out in May. So we will engage in the normal process that we do.
But how does the information come to your disposal? I mean, you can take market reports about volumes that are going through the sale yards and going to slaughter and going overseas, but is a individual producer filling out some sort of return that would come to your desk, Mr. Strong?
So in the market projections process, we engage directly with key participants in the market as well, so both producers and processors, to understand what's happening in the market, in addition to readily available market information that we gather in the normal course of collecting that information.
So has anyone got a sense of, they talk about 500,000 head, and let's use that as a reference point, it may be more or less.
Yeah.
Do we know what the profile of those cattle were, whether they were, I mean, a lot of that country south of Richmond, Julia Creek, black soil stuff where the real problems occurred was, backgrounding, which will bring different impacts to the market as opposed to being breeders. Do we know any breakdown of the...
So the short answer to that is no. So there's been some speculation and there's been some commentary made, and there's obviously been one
consistent with what I just said, or...
I think the difference is there's a difference in the percentages that might have been lost in some areas and the total numbers that would have been lost. So in the areas that you're talking about, there were high percentages of livestock lost, whereas I think the big numbers of livestock are actually going to be north of the road, where that 300 by 100k sort of sea went through is where the big numbers are going to be, but the herds up there are obviously much larger, being more of the corporate.
Yeah, but I'm interested
businesses,
if they've lost the 07 and 08 wean,
Yeah.
if that's what was lost, it'll impact on the market, it'll have a little hiatus and it'll sort itself. But if they were breeders, that hiatus is going to would you agree, it would have a longer impact in the marketplace?
So it would, yes. So depending on percentages of those categories that are involved in the total losses. So largely there will be a combination of both. There will be cows and there will be young cattle that have been lost in those total numbers, but we're not going to have...
Because I met with a lot of the producers up there immediately after I was up there with the minister, and many of them had, the calf factory up in the Gulf more so, and they used this to background, having a couple of years of backgrounders on there, particularly at that time of the year. So I'd be really interested, because some of the decisions that might come from this, will be influenced by that. The impacts on the national herd, how quickly it's going to renew itself, and that style of thing. So I'd be interested to know in time what the breakdown was of the profile of the cattle.
Certainly, and I think that will be instructive when we get to that point, but we're a few months away from actually having that.
And current impacts on slaughter numbers out of Townsville, for example, have they been able to keep their kill up, or...?
So it's more been related to logistics rather than available numbers to date.
Road and rail being out, yep.
But to date, the most recent rains in some areas has had an impact on some of the flow, but up until that point it was more logistics rather than available livestock.
Yep. And the live job? Numbers out of Townsville?
So I don't have details on that, but I think again it's the same. So it's more logistics rather than available cattle at the minute.
Yep.
But we would expect that to flow through. If there's going to be an impact, that would start flowing through.
And one final question, with the flooding up in the Gulf itself, so, we're up at, we'll talk about, Corumba and
Yep.
the surrounds. When we went up there and met with local authorities and other community reps, they were sort of indicating to us that this was business as usual for them, nothing unusual, but the big waters hadn't really made their way. They were still sort of gravitating. Cloncurry was reporting impacts. So is that how it turned out? Did the Gulf have a capacity to diffuse and distribute this water, and therefore it didn't have any massive out of normal impacts?
That's certainly not what I understand. And knowing some of the operators in that area, what ended up happening in that Gulf region, particularly north of the road with the big volumes of water, was significantly higher than the 74 flood, for example. When I say
And we had stock losses.
significant stock losses, yeah,
Yeah,
and unprecedented stock losses and unprecedented flooding.
Because the emerging legend doesn't talk so much about the Gulf; it talks about that Julia Creek Richmond area.
Yeah, I think the significant difference. So that the Julia Creek area, so the south of the road piece or either side of the road, there was broad scale flooding and a lot of challenge around exposure, particularly with the amount of time that the rain went and the change in temperature was a big impact. The damage north was very much as a result of the massive amount of flooding.
And one final question: the profile of the cattle in the damage the further north you went is more likely to be cow-calf or
more likely to be cows and calves. That's right.
Yeah.
Most of those younger, closer to sale weight cattle likely would have been off by then.
Yep. All right.
Just wondering, did you do a Senator Rice thing? So I've got one more question I had before.
Yeah, I did, but it's close to the election, so I'm taking up as much time as I can for the government here.
Would never have guessed.
Do you have any questions, Senator Stewart?
I just, I wanted to, if I could, yes. I wanted to touch upon the projections for the sheep industry for 2019 in the Industry Projections 2019 document.
Yep.
Meat and Livestock Australia. This may be questions that could be put to the Livestock Export Corporation. It notes that sheep meat exports broke all records in 2018 for exports to the US, China, Middle East. Australian supply is unable to keep pace with demand. While live sheep exports had hit their lowest numbers in 3 decades and may dip under 1 million head this year. Are you able to advise about the value of the sheep meat export trade relative to the live sheep trade?
No, I'm not.
Value?
Off the top of my head, no. I'm not able to comment on that.
Okay.
I can add a little bit to your
Yes.
comment about the projections on the export market, and you are correct that 2018 was our largest export year for sheep meat. I think 447,000 tonnes, and those markets that you mentioned,
447,000 tonnes
of sheep meat that we
yes.
exported. Yeah,
Yes.
and those markets are ones that we've been working on, very closely to establish those more consistent, higher quality markets, and we're seeing the benefit from that. So particularly the US and China.
You have that 447,000 tonnes sheep meat, and is there any comparison you can make with in terms of live sheep, in terms of the value of the exports?
Not with a degree of accuracy at the moment. We can come back to you on that, or
Yes.
like I say, live exporters might have that information.
Okay.
But they're also not a one-for-one. So
Yes.
an animal that goes to one market is not necessarily the same as an animal that goes to the other, and it's the same as our meat that goes to the sheep meat that goes to China may not necessarily be tradable for the sheep meat that goes to the US. So while we have the discrete markets that we go to, they're not immediately transferable one to the other.
Well, if you could come back to me on in terms of the value, relative values of sheep meat export and live sheep trade, because I'm quite interested in that in terms of the industry going forward. There have been, what would you characterise in terms of the impending regulatory reforms from the current heat stress risk assessment review and the review of the Australian standards for the export of livestock, in terms of your understanding of their impact on the live sheep trade?
I think that's a better question for the live call. Yeah, I think.
Righto.
Chair, can we just have
Yes.
a bit more sound on the microphone?
Yes, sorry, I'll
for
talk
Senator
louder
Storer,
as well.
please?
No,
it's very hard.
He needs to take a leaf out of my
Yeah.
book. It's just shouldn't.
Blast away a bit more. Righto. Okay.
I'm not sure I'd go that far, Chair, but if we could just have a bit
okay.
more sound on
Senator
Senator
Wild,
Storer's microphone.
Of course, most of those sheep that end up in the live trade
Yes.
in some way come through the production system that we're part of as well. Our responsibility and our interest is very much in the production of them, but we also want to be supporting those other trades in the best way we possibly can. So the market, the live export market is a very important component of particularly our Western Australian sheep producers'
Yes.
options.
Indeed. In my state of South Australia, there hasn't been a single live sheep export shipment since May of last year, and so the trade has been stopped through that state for almost a year. Are you aware of any major disruptions to the South Australian sheep industry as a result of that cessation?
I'm not able to comment on it. I'm not aware, but I'm not informed well enough to be saying that
Okay.
in a definitive way. So
Okay,
that,
well-
again, I think it'd be a better question.
Just a little
Yes.
qualifying
Yes.
question around this. Would it be fair to say, Mr Strong, both in your experience before MLA and now, that if a market that receives live animals, sheep or cattle, could or had an ambition to take it in the form of chilled beef or frozen beef or processed beef, it would be, from our point of view on this side, the exporter, preferable. We'd do that. There's some reason why the customer's not looking for chilled beef, and often, they don't have a fridge, or they go to a wet market, the beast is slaughtered, it's taken away and consumed sort of same day.
And I think, Sanders, if you look at the progression of our markets, and one of the things we do in our market insights is actually map the development of our markets and the consumers in those markets and where we see the improvement and increase in value. And on the beef side, for example, totally separate to a discussion about live export, you look at somewhere like China, where last year was over 160,000 tonnes, but up until the 2010, 11, 12 type period was a less than 10,000 tonne market, where it's now consistently one of our top 4 or 5 markets. The consumers have progressed in the available income that they have, but also in the sophistication of their meat supply chain. So they're able to receive product in chilled or frozen form and then manage it through their supply chain and deliver it to their consumers and capture value. If we do an assessment of the development of our meat markets and the way they progress from a commodity lower value market through to a higher value, more branded, a higher margin contributor to our supply chain, many of the markets on the more commodity end of that scale are also live export markets as well. So roundabout way, Senator, I think it's being able to add more value to the product that we export. If we can add more value to it here and we can provide a higher quality, higher margin product to our customers overseas, we have evidence of actually doing that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they're not a one-for-one. We can't take product that we would currently send as feeder cattle to a current live export
Yeah, but
market
this
and
push
turn
we
around and
get
send
all
it
the
somewhere
time,
else.
we should never send a live beast. We should only sell chilled and frozen. It's on the premise that, well, if you deny them a live article, they'll have to take the frozen or the chilled. That is nonsense, isn't it? It's nonsense.
So it is. It's how we work with those customers and countries to provide them with the highest value, highest margin product we can. That's what our industry is very focused on. And while we're one of the 4 large, so talk about beef, large beef exporting countries, we're one of the smallest producers. So out of the 50 to 60 million tonnes of product which is consumed on the beef side each year, we export about 1 million of it. So we're a reasonably small player, but we're a high margin player. So the opportunity for us is how we actually capture the most value. So how we develop those markets in the best possible way.
All right. You done?
Yes,
Senator
done,
Steele,
done,
you're done?
Keen to move on.
Thank you,
you very
Mr
much.
Strong, and a very strong original performance, can I say? And thank you to your team, and we wish you safe travel back to where you're from.
Thank you very much, Senators.
And we'll